We're back from outer space. We just walked in to find you here with that look upon your face. All right, we are in the historical background section of our year one philosophy of mind course. We're going to briefly look at Aristotle. We looked at Plato with a chopped up, horrible excerpt, but we're not going to reread that since we've read it elsewhere. We're going to be reading it again in another class. Oh, hey, Elena's here. Good to see you. We're already live. Um, So we're going to look at Aristotle and Rene Descartes and Locke. So today's Aristotle. Now, let's pay careful attention to the ideas that Aristotle has here. Remember, we had talked about the Platonic and the Aristotelian as two different attempts from the very beginning to grapple with what Socrates was accomplishing. The Aristotelian, if you remember the painting, remember painting is Plato's like this, and Aristotle's doing this, right? He's looking out at the particulars of the world around him. So they're both talking about the forms, this Socratic ultimate truths, but Plato wants to find them up there. And the rationalist approach, the reason and philosophy can get you to the invisible, real, true, or higher things. Whereas Aristotle, who's also looking for those ultimate kinds of truth, he wants to find them in the particulars that are around, right? So for Plato, they're like shadows that are pointing at something that's really real here. But for Aristotle, it's more like, no, look, you can kind of your method of getting to them at least is through interaction with the particulars. It's much more of an empirical instinct. Okay. Now he's going to talk about the soul as the organizational principle. Let's think about what the heck that means in the context of the way he's using it. Organizational principle. So the oak tree has a soul. The soul of the oak tree is the that organizational principle within the oak tree that makes the material of the oak tree be oak tree like. Maybe it's the double helix that he's talking about, right? I don't know. Let's just we haven't talked about this much before, but Tartaglia and I were having a conversation the other day, and um, I think I read to him an excerpt from Scott Adams's God's Debris to try to prime his thinking on a point that I don't think he was too convinced by. But I was trying to make the point that we have these scientific terms. Scott called them placeholders that people forget are placeholders, and they think that the words magically actually explain things when they don't. I think he's right about that. I think he's so right about it that, well, why start this debate now? I won't be able to do it. I won't be able to do any better than I did with him the other day. But the idea is that it's possible to think about and to use conceptual tools for the world that are very, 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 very different than the ones that we just happen to be most comfortable with today. And it's also possible that some of those approaches could be as true, more true, or at least more helpful, which is pretty close to being true than the ones that we're using. So, one of the things that I think is very important to do when we're looking at Anaximander and Anaximenes and Thales and all the Parmenides, Lucretius, all of these ancient philosophers that we'll be doing in the beginning part of the year two course is R read it like a novel in a sense, get into it. Don't try to be like, "Well, you're not using the term bending space in order to make gravity work, and so why am I even reading you?" It's like, no, maybe, you know, there's other ways of conceptualizing the world than saying little bits of hard stuff and little and spaces of nothingness and it traveling through. There's ancient Greek philosophers that are thinking of it as wave potentials, as flowing in and out of things rather than being in a specific location, and these conceptualizations they got to for good reasons, and some of them make our most recent contemporary physics experiments comprehensible in a way that they're not because it's not possible to comprehend them, but because the terms that we're using and the concepts we're using are still too much Cartesian or Newtonian or something like that. So um we'll be missing out on an awful lot of the value when we read these ancient Greeks if we assume that the terms that we're using are more than placeholders, are actually correct in some sort of like final kind of a way. And that would be terrible. So we'll discuss it, but if he uses the phrase organizational principle, let's try to think about what the heck he means by that and how true it could be, right? If you're reading a play and all you're doing is trying to remind yourself constantly that it isn't true in a certain historical sense, you're going to be missing the point of the play. And without justifying it too much right now, let's just take for granted that the concepts we're using to do our science might not be uh, the final concepts, the ultimate ones that actually make sense of things, including our own experiments that we're doing. And since we might need other concepts, and since some of them have been developed from ancient times and were working and seem to fit along better with some of our experiments, maybe we should be willing to go and, suspend our disbelief and try to imagine thinking of the world in these other types of ways. So, in any case, let's see if we can figure out what he means by the soul. So, the soul as bodily organization, excerpt from Aristotle's De Anima, Book 2, Chapter 2, it says here. 412A3 for those who are, in case we don't know, it's like Bible verse numbers are put into the Bible at some later date. They've done the same thing with this. So that's the line. Okay. Enough has been said of the views about the soul which have been handed down from our predecessors. Let us start again, as it were, from the beginning and try to determine what the soul is and what would be its most comprehensive definition. Now we speak of one particular kind of existent things as substance, and under this heading, we so speak of one thing qua matter, which in itself is not a particular, another qua shape and form, in virtue of which it is then spoken of as a particular, and a third qua the product of these two. And matter is potentiality, while form is actuality, and that in two ways, first as knowledge is, and second as contemplation is. Okay. Descartes hated this. Who we're going to be reading next, really, really, really hated all of these ways of thinking about the world. And it's been argued, and I think there's some truth to it, that that little philosophical work of his, which is fantastic, and which we'll be reading in year two, but we'll also be reading an excerpt from it in the very next chapter, was an attempt to revolutionize the philosophical foundation so that he could do a totally different kind of science. He really, really hated these ways of thinking about things. But let's spend a quick moment on this paragraph before we move on. Now we speak of one particular kind of existent things as substance. Okay, so we've got an idea of stuffness, maybe. And under this heading, we so speak of one thing qua matter, which in itself is not a particular, another qua shape and form, in virtue of which it is then spoken of as a particular, and a third qua the product of these two. And matter is potentiality, while form is actuality. And that in two ways, not first as knowledge is, and second as contemplation is. Okay. We won't spend too much time, but we're going to spend some time on this first paragraph. But the rest of it, we're just going to spend our focus on what's immediately being talked about for mind and soul. Oh, it seems like what he's doing, maybe, tell me if I'm wrong. I'm trying to wrestle with this. Is he's separating out the rational and the empirical approaches. He's saying, wait, there's a substanceness. Let's call it stuffness. There's a stuffness out there. That's the basic conception that I have of thingness or substance. But I can cut that idea. Remember, the scholastics are worshiping Aristotle, and they're always making distinctions between things. I can cut that idea into two things. One, uh, matter, but let's call it stuffness qua stuffness. Um, it's the potential to have a thing be, and then there's the actual ways that it is. All right. So he says form and shape. Okay. So there's the ways that things actually are, but then there's just the notion of being stuffness. And both of those multiplied together give me the ways that I can interact with thingness in the world. So one is sort of the rationalist concept of stuffiness or stuffness, and the other one is, hey, something I'm measuring. Oh, look, this is triangular shaped. This thing is in this location or whatever. So he's not just doing the empirical side, right? He's very close to Socrates. Both Plato and Aristotle are very close. They're just like the beginning of the splitting of the cell, like, of the division of the cell. No, never mind the cheat code. Substance, shape, form, principle. I wish I could make this larger so I could read it better. Would you like to come unmute and tell us what you're saying here? Cheat code. Okay. Um, I can hear you now.
Okay. Um, Hello and hello, Sivad. So this is mentioned by Aristotle in his metaphysics book that all things are organized by four aspects: substance, shape, form, and principle. Now, the reason why I added it to the private chat here in StreamYard is just a little note. I wanted to have like a tiny cheat code over there to have.
Very good.
Thank you.
Oh, that's super helpful. Okay, so you're going to be our guide and expert taking us through this. So, okay, so far in this second paragraph, and he's got the notion of substance. I'm calling it stuffness, but let's call it substance. But he's splitting that notion into being qua being as far as stuffness goes, but then the actual particulars about it that you could interact with. Because he says this beingness is potential. It's not actually there. And then there's the product between the two. So it's like I'm just going to talk it out until we can try to be in Aristotle's mind here. It's very, very different ways of thinking than we normally do. So it's like in order for something to be that I'm going to be measuring, it has to be the product of, right, so the multiplication between the form and the shape that it manifests and the beingness itself, which is potential, which isn't there without these other things, right? So he's calling it potential, which means it's not there unless it's the product of these other things. But there's something more to being than just the shape, right? He's not David Hume, right? So there's more to being than just the things that you're measuring. There is a multiplication between those things and the potentiality to be. But then that's when you get that. Okay, fine. Let's move on. It is bodies, especially which are thought to be substances, and of these, especially natural bodies. For these are sources of the rest. Of natural bodies, some have life and some do not. I love this. And it is self nourishment, growth, and decay that we speak of as life. Hence, every natural body which partakes of life will be a substance, and substance of a composite kind. Okay, he's giving us his taxonomy. Of all the things that can be, love this. All of the things that could be substances, natural bodies, you can then partition them, cut them into sections, those with life and those without life, right? So you've sort of got physics and chemistry and geology, and then you can draw a line, and now you've got those on one side and you've got biology on another side.
May
What
I
is it?
add something?
Yes, sir, sure, certainly.
Substance refers to the fundamental nature of a thing, fundamental nature, while the essence refers to what makes a thing what it is.
Okay, so let me ask. Essence is more like shape and form. Substance is more like matter or being.
You could say it that way.
Is that correct though?
Substance is prior to other beings
Okay,
in
yes.
general.
Okay.
It is like the source. What
Yes,
emits
yes.
is essences.
Wait, what is essences?
What emits from you.
Got it. Yep.
There's another way to create a correlation. Substance is the source, and what emits is the essence.
That's perfect. That sounds really beautiful. Good. Thank you for that. That's helpful. Okay, cool. I can see that. Okay, that's good. So we can see how he's coming from this Socratic perspective, but very different from Plato, right? Plato wants to run to what Aristotle might call substance. He wants to run to the forms up in that direction. Whereas Aristotle is saying, well, there ain't no manifestation of that until it's the multiplied by these other measurable things. Yes? Am I hearing you correctly?
Can you please repeat the last sentence?
Okay, okay, good. So what you're telling me is that for Aristotle, substance is the it's like that invisible beingness quality, and you don't get an actual thing until that's multiplied by shape and form.
Um, I suppose that is correct. Substance is the primary category.
Okay. I think I'm getting it. Maybe I'm misspeaking. Let's continue then,
Have in mind, before you go on, and
please.
I promise
No,
to
please.
shut it. Have in mind that Aristotle has 10 categories in general. The primary one, the source of all, is substance.
For all things that can be is
Yeah,
substance.
yes,
Okay. So
substance.
it's
It's
gonna be
prior
the
to other
common
beings.
it's substance is common for all that is mind and all that is body. Is that right?
Um, pair.
What?
There is there is a there is a tiny fine line that needs to be filled, and unfortunately, right at this right moment, I cannot offer that information. Let's hope that in a minute I will be able. But
Okay, good.
substance is
Let's same
definitely
with me.
the primary category, so to say, the source.
Okay, good. The source. I like that. I think that sounds correct from what we've read so far. Okay, we're in the same boat. Let's dive in and see what we can get from him. Okay. It is bodies, especially which are thought to be substances. You can divide it into the biological and the non-life. And then he defines life. Life are those things, those substances which manifest self-nourishment, growth, and decay. Okay. So a rock just sits there and it just is a rock. Okay. It might have decay, but it needs all three to be life. To be life, you have to be able to grow and make more of what you are, right? To maybe take the materials around you and turn them into oak treeness or a humanity or something like that. So your ability to self-nourishment, growth, and decay. If you've got those, then we call you a living thing. If so grass and gazelles and people. And if you don't do those things, we call you, a rock or a star or maybe a river. Okay. Since hence every natural body which partakes of life will be a substance and substance of a composite kind. So he says, therefore, life is in this category of substances. Okay. With those qualities. But actuality is so spoken of in two ways. It's always distinctions, right? First, as knowledge is, and second, as contemplation is. It is clear then that the soul is actuality, as knowledge is. For both sleep and waking depend on the existence of soul. And waking is analogous to contemplation, and sleep to the possession, but not the exercise of knowledge. In the same individual, knowledge is in origin prior. Hence, the soul is the first actuality of a natural body which has life potentially. The soul is the first actuality of a natural body which has life potentially. Okay, that's interesting. Another comment to make is that I believe this is correct. Correct me if I'm wrong, but all of the works of Aristotle that we have were put together by student notes. Okay, so Aristotle's up there with the big slate and chalkboard, and he's making a lot of points, and then the students are writing down all of the conclusions that he's coming to, and then that becomes the sentences in the paragraphs. You can kind of see that in that last paragraph. Whatever has origins will be a body of this kind. So anything that comes into being will be a body of this kind. Even the parts of plants are origins. I'm sorry, are organs. There we go. Whatever has organs will be a body of this kind. Even the parts of plants are organs, although extremely simple ones. Example, the leaf is a covering for the pod, and the pod for the fruit, while roots are analogous to the mouth, for both take in food. You see his observations. If then, uh, his inaccurate observations or partially accurate observations, but you see how he's thinking, right? He's thinking more scientifically. If then we are to speak of something common to every soul, it will be the first actuality of a natural body which has organs. Okay, cool. So, where do you find souls? You only find them in living things. What else do you know is always true of living things? That they have parts that perform functions to serve the growth, nourishment, or decay of the things, the growth of the things. So, if you're going to have a soul, it's going to be in a body that has organs. Hence, two, we should not ask whether the soul and body are one, any more than whether the wax and the impression are one, or in general, whether the matter of each thing and that of which it is the matter are one. I love it. We're gonna have to start diving in. Just let my brain adjust a minute, and we'll get into Aristotle's way of thinking. It's pretty fun. Or in general, whether the matter of each thing and that of which it is the matter are one. For while utility and being are so spoken of in many ways, that which is most properly so spoken of is the actuality. We won't belabor it again. This is interesting. Okay. It has then been stated in general what the soul is, for it is substance, that corresponding to the principle of the thing. And this is, quote, what it is for it to be what it was, for a body of such a kind. Compare the following. If an instrument, example, an axe, were a natural body, then its substance would be that, or would be what it is to be an axe. And this would be its soul. If this were removed, it would no longer be an axe, except homonymously. But as it is an axe, for it is not of this kind of body that the soul is what it is for it to be what it was, and the principle, but of a certain kind of natural body having within itself a source of movement and rest. Okay, so an axe is not one of these living things with a soul, but there's still the definitional principles of being organized in axe like ways. And we can use this as an analogy. All right, we've got a comment here. Oh, cool. Thank you. All right, we'll look at that in a second. So, as an analogy only, right? We're not saying an axe has a soul, and we're not saying it's like one of these living organisms, but we're saying as an analogy, there's something in the organizational principle of axe likeness that it can be swung and that it can has a sharp edge and that it can perform the chopping of wood or something like that. There's the almost the definitional principle of axe likeness that gives it it's well, that makes it an axe, and if it didn't have that, it would still be the same material, right? Imagine if you well you took an axe, but it wasn't not it not only wasn't sharp, but it was a hammer, right? The metal on the end didn't do axe-like things. It was just blunt on both ends, and maybe it had the exact same amount of wood affixed to the head, but the wood was split in half, and half of it was on one side and half of it was on the other, but it was firmly, I mean, it's not an axe. Whatever the hell it is, it's not an axe anymore, but it's still exactly the same matter, made up of the same components. It's just they're rearranged differently, and now you don't have an axe anymore. Says, I'm not saying an axe is like that, but I'm saying that's what it's like to be a living organism. It's like you've got all of the material parts that make you up, but they have to be doing the oak tree thingness in order to, and they have to be organized in an oak tree like way in order for you to have the oak tree. And you can chop down the oak tree and then you can turn it into a bunch of axes. It's like, okay, it ain't no oak tree anymore, right? So it's just an analogy, but that's the sort of thing he's going to be looking for inside living organisms. It's like an organizational principle. It has then been stated in general what the soul is, for it is substance that corresponding to the principle of the thing, the principle of the thing. Okay. We must consider what has been said in relation to the parts of the body also. For if the eye were an animal, sight would be its soul, for this is an eye's substance, that corresponding to its principle. This is an interesting kind of use of the word substance, okay? The eye is matter for sight, and if this fails, it is no longer an eye except homonymously, just like an eye in stone or a painted eye. We must now apply to the whole living body that which applies to the part. For as the part is to the part, so analogously is perception as a whole to the whole perceptive body as such. Okay, cool. It's getting clearer what he's saying. We got a statue of Hercules over here, and I can point to the eyeball of Hercules, of the statue of Hercules. And Aristotle's saying that's not an eye, right? It's not an eye because it doesn't see anything. That's what makes an eye eye-ness. It's made of matter, and the eye is made of matter. But the eye, if it were like an organism, well, let's not go down that road. Let's just stick to this for now. The eye sees things. That's what makes it an eye. Just like the axe can cut things and be swung to cut things, that's what makes it an axe. If I make an axe in the same shape as an axe, but I make it out of Nerf foam or something like that, it's not an axe. I can use the name axe because it's a representation of an axe or something like that, but it isn't an axe. What makes an axe is its functionality, what it can do. What makes an eye is the fact that it can see. So this is very easy. We all understand this. Now we're going to try to apply this way of thinking to the entirety of the organism. What makes an oak tree an oak tree? What makes a human being as a living organism? Right? What is it? Right? What's its substance or its, I like this phrase better, of course, this the principle of the thing. It is not that which has lost its soul, which is potentially such as to live, but that which possesses it. Seeds and fruit are potentially bodies of this kind. Okay, wow. Oh, awesome. Okay. So an apple tree seed contains the apple tree nature, the soul. I mean, he hasn't used the word soul yet, but it's in there. It's in there somewhere because it has the organizational principle to become a full apple tree. It's a potential body. Just then, as the cutting and the seeing, so too is the waking state actuality, while the soul is like sight and the potentiality of the instrument. The body is that which is this is this potentially. But just as the pupil and sight make up an eye, so in this case, the soul and body make up an animal. Okay. The soul is a waking principle Remember David Hume thought he wasn't real when he was asleep? Holy cow. Okay. The waking state is actuality. The soul is like sight and the potentiality of the instrument. Okay, so he's really separating function from material makeup. Okay, there's the material makeup of the axe, but if it's not organized properly in the way that makes it axe like, it ain't no axe. So there's something more than just its material. There's the shape and the location of an eye, but that can exist in the statue of Hercules. That ain't an eye. It has to have the functionality of an eye to be an eye. Those are analogies for the soul. The thing that is animated, right? De anima, right? That's the name of the book. Anima is the thing that makes you animated. So he said what makes an animal or what makes a living organism is self growth, or no, self nourishment, growth, and decay. But I don't know if he's disagreeing or taking for granted the idea that animation is what we're talking about often when we talk about the soul in ancient Greece. It's like the rock just sits there, but the donkey can walk around. The donkey has a soul, it has an anima that animates it, right? It's a self-moving thing. And he understood the vegetative soul, right? The tree is nourishment and it's growth. So the tree is a living thing. He could have categorized it as a non-living thing because it's not walking around, but he understood that it was actioning. And in any event, this soul is the waking principle. This anima is what animates, and it's analogous to the function of the thing, right? The function of the axe is to be swung and cut. The function of the eye is to see. The function of a living organism is to is consciousness, is the soul, is an awareness, or I'm listing all these things because I'm not saying he means all these things. I'm saying let's throw darts at exactly what he means here, right? It's not just the fact that you're awake. It's he's going to use the phrase organizational principle, but let's think through what it is that he's aiming at here. It seems to be something that's alive when you're awake, specifically when you're awake. Like when you're asleep, you have the potential knowing, is what he said. But when you're awake, your soul is, it's like the eye is, let's say a blind eye is like a sleeping person. But then if the pupil opens and light penetrates and it can see, now it's an awake person in the analogy. Okay. That therefore the soul or certain parts of it, if it is divisible, cannot be separated from the body is quite clear. For in some cases, the actuality is of the parts themselves. Not that anything prevents, at any rate, some parts from being separable because of there being actualities of no body. Furthermore, it is not clear whether the soul is the actuality of the body in the way that the sailor is of the ship. Let this suffice as a rough definition and sketch about the soul. Well, let's let it for now. Section 2. Since it is from things which are obscure. Oh, I'm sorry, Elena. Did you want to add anything else to that first section for us or that last paragraph? I'm becoming aware as we're doing this of how much I should have been I should have been reading more Aristotle to prepare for this section, but go ahead.
If you think that there is a point in reading what I added to the chat.
Oh, yes, thank you for reminding me. Okay, good. Substances can manifest as either primary substances, the unique individuals that populate our world, or secondary substances, which encapsulate broader categories and kinds. Oh, good. It put the whole quote in there. Thank you. Which encapsulate. Okay, great. Awesome. So remember that. Thank you. That's helpful. So Plato and Aristotle, I'm saying, are wrestling with what Socrates was up to. There's some very similar notions bouncing back between the two, and they're disagreeing about exactly what they mean, right? But Aristotle is not disregarding the forms. He's not disregarding that type of a notion, but he's trying to bring it back down to earth. Okay. So substances can manifest either as primary substances. That's first for him. First for him is the particular. Here is an object. It has a location, it has a shape, it has a form, it has a function. Those are the things that I want to talk about first. That's what comes to me first through the senses, perhaps. But he's not denying that there isn't anything. He's not saying there's nothing beyond that. He's saying secondary substance, you can think of it as participating in the form, right? Now, for Plato, this is a shadow of the form that is really real. This is just an approximation. It's actualizing its potential to participate in the form, the really real thing that we really want to get to. For Aristotle, flip that completely upside down. He's like, if you want to find the form, you got to look in here. You got to look at this sort of a thing and then look at a bunch of them and make an abstraction and do that. But the form is in here and in general here. He doesn't want to look away from these things in order to find it. But he also isn't saying there's no such thing. He's not saying, well, that sounds like nonsense to me, and I'm going to go be David Hume now, and it's all shadows and nothing else, or something like that. So we're starting to put him somewhere here. Thank you. That was very good. There we go. Very good. Very good. Very good. Let's see. Let's see if we can hold on to this roller coaster. Sorry, I'm not being a better guide. Let's see.
May I add something before
Yeah,
we
please.
proceed to the second portion of the essay? That one of Aristotle's foundational concepts on his whole ontology was ilomorphismos. It is called in Greek. In English, it is translated into hilomorphism. So this is a two terms composite word from ili, which is matter, and morphi, which is form. Ili is it is not just inert or passive, it is an underlying, unformed, and potentially receptive element that gives physical reality its structure. It might help to the example of the oak tree and the vegetative soul that you mentioned a bit earlier. Ili is formless on its own and requires the imposition of form to have identity and structure. So it serves as the substrate upon which form is impressed. Now, form or morphe in Greek, um, it is the organizing and defining principle that shapes and gives structure to matter.
Yeah,
I hope that helps.
I'm so glad you're here. I am so glad you're
Form
here. This
and
is so much better. Thank you.
last but not least, form is what provides identity, purpose, and characteristics to an entity, and it is the specific configuration or arrangement that differentiates one thing from another. Form.
Right. Okay. God damn, it's so good that you're here right now. That is so helpful. Okay, so notice that what that means is that this Eli, E-L-I, is that the
It's
first?
Ili in Greek. It's Y-L and
Okay.
E. In
Yeah.
English, you will find the term as Hyle.
Awesome. Notice that this Ely is less real. It's potentiality, as he said in the first paragraph here, right? It's potential, but it's not fully real yet until it's wedded to or the product of, so multiplied by the particulars that allow it to be something. Yes?
Exactly. It refers to what an entity can become. So it represents the inherent capacities, the possibilities, and the potential characteristics that an entity possesses, but has not yet realized or haven't been yet actualized. So potentiality, it is about what something could be or do in the future, contrary to actuality, which is entelechia, by the way.
Okay, right. Notice it's a complete inversion. It's like he's taking Plato and he's turning him on his head. You see that? For Plato, The abstraction is the thing that is really real that you're trying to get through the use of reason and to relate to in that eternal space where nothing is in flux and changing, the proper place for the soul to be in communion with other things that are like that. And for Aristotle, the abstraction is potentiality. It's there. It's really important. You can't have something without the he's even translated as matter back here, but not a good translation for the idea, obviously. It's the potentiality of being, but until it has clothes put on it, until it has the particulars that it's wedded to, it can't be anything. So it's like the abstract. It's whether or not the abstraction is the form or whether or not the particulars are the abstraction. Wait, did I say that backwards? No, I just constructed it poorly. It's whether or not the abstraction is what you're trying to get to. Like, so for Plato, there's lots of different oak trees. One of them is healthier and more of an oak tree than the other oak tree because it's closer to the form of the ideal oak tree, say. It might have been that particular, it might have been more particular, it might have been less. People argue about it, but let's just use this as for the analogy right now. The tree that is most like the ideal tree is the one that's actualizing the potential to be like the thing that is most real. For Aristotle, he's got the same parts, but it's inverted. The abstraction is not as real. It's not as real until it becomes a particular. It requires the limitations of shape and form to come along and be married to it in order for it to actually be real. So far, so good? I mean, am I correct?
As far as I understand what you said, yes.
Okay, maybe I'm not wording it well. All right, it's quite helpful. All right. Since it is from things which are obscure, but more obvious, that we arrive at that which is clear and more intelligible in respect to the principle involved, we must try again in this way to treat of the soul. For a defining statement should not only make clear the fact, as the majority of definitions do, but it should also contain and reveal the reason for it. As things are, the statements of the definitions are like conclusions. For example, what is squaring? The construction of an equilateral rectangle equal to one which is not equilateral. The construction of an equilateral rectangle equal to one which is not equilateral. Okay, fine. But such a definition is a statement of the conclusion, whereas one who says that squaring is the discovery of the mean proportional states of the reason or of the mean proportional states the reason for the circumstance. Okay, I read it poorly. Let's read it again. Here's what he's saying. What is the notion of squaring? It means take a rectangle and make two of its sides shorter until they're equal to the two sides that are getting longer to maintain the same area. So take a rectangle, keep its area the same, but shorten the longer sides and therefore lengthen the shorter side so the area is the same until it becomes equilateral. That is the process of making a square. But such a definition is the statement of the conclusion. Whereas one who says that squaring is the discovery of the mean proportional states, I'm sorry, the discovery of the mean proportional states the reason for the circumstance. Let's try to get this right here. So that would be the first one is the explanation of how to make a square. The second one is saying, what I want you to do is find the average length or the middle length, the mean length of a side that would allow all four sides to be the same. That's stating the reason for making a square or the reason that it is a square. So the nature of a square, Aristotle is assuming we're going to keep up with him here, is to have no excess of length and in inferiority of length in the relationships between any of the sides. We got to just sort of start with the concept of the area being the same, I think. So if somebody tells you, hey, the way you make a square is you just keep the area the same, but shorten the extra long ones and lengthen the short ones until they're all the same, that's how you get to a square. But if someone simply says, find the mean proportional, find the the length that would be the same on all sides for it to be still the same area, then that's the aim of squareness or the definition of squareness. Okay. So we say then, making a beginning of our inquiry, that that which has soul is distinguished from that which has not by life. All right. Ensouled things are living things, non ensouled things are not alive. But life is so spoken of in many ways. And we say that a thing lives if but one of the following is present: intellect, perception, movement, and rest in respect of place. And furthermore, the movement involved in nutrition and both decay and growth. He's expanding the list a little bit. He's saying all you need is one of these things. If you have any one of these things, we would say that you have life. And we understand that the soul is the distinguishing thing between living things and non-living things. And he is defining nutrition as movement. So it's animation. So there's the anima. For this reason, all plants too are thought to live, for they evidently have in them such a potentiality and first principle, through which they come to grow and decay in opposite directions. For they do not grow upwards without growing downwards, but they grow in both directions alike and in every direction. This being so of all that are constantly nourished and continue to live, as long as they are able to receive nourishment. This form of life can exist apart from the others, but the others cannot exist apart from it in mortal creatures. This is obvious in the case of plants, for they have no other potentiality of soul. Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. I thought he was saying that you need plant life to have animal life. What he's saying is the nutrition and growth principle is all you need for life because that's the only one that the plants have. Okay. It is then because of this first principle that living things have life, but it is because of sense perception, first of all, that they will be an animal. For even those things which do not move or change their place, but which do have sense perception, we speak of as animals and not merely as living. Okay, just making categories here. There's stuffness, there's living stuffness that has to have nutrition. That's the first principle. But then there's stuffness that's living that can move around. Those things are animals and not plants. Oh, no, it's sense perception. I'm so sorry. This is interesting. It's not that they move around. There are things that can't move around, but that have sense perception. And if they have sense perception, we call them animals and not just plants. We don't have to agree with this. We just have to understand how he's categorizing it, right? So there's stuff. It's made up of this secondary principle, this potentiality wedded to form and shape. That a proton, if you want to consider, or a rock or a pebble, a mountain, all of the things that are like that. Then there's some of them that have the capacity of nutrition and growth and decay. Growth slash decay, we'll call it one concept on both sides. That's the first principle of souls because plants have souls because they grow, but that's the only principle that they have. So that makes them living. But then there's some things that have something beyond that. They have sense perception. And if they have sense perception, even if they don't move around, but they have sense perception, they're animals, they're not plants. That's how. Okay, so another thing to notice is that a lot of Aristotle's arguments will be in the form of look around and see the way we talk about these things. Let's see what we can learn about it. So, for instance, in his Ethics, which is really the only writings of Aristotle that I know, so sorry that this is so clunky today. But in his ethics, he'll say, okay, well, what are the virtues? He'll name the virtues. He'll say, oh, courage, martial courage. That's one of the virtues. Okay. How can we figure out what that is? Well, let's look around. Phil. Everybody knows Phil's a courageous guy. Let's figure out what it is about him that makes him courageous, right? He's not starting the question with give me a definition of courage. Let's see if it applies to Phil. He's looking at Phil and saying, "Hey, we know that's the guy, right? That's the guy with the courage. He's brave in battle. What is it about him that makes him courageous? Can we plot that out and say, how close am I to that? How could I get closer to it? That'll be our ethical discussion, right? So he's now doing this with the categories of living organisms. He's saying, well, how do we talk about it, right? I mean, we say that things that an enema, amoeba. What's the word? What's that sea creature? An enema. What's that sea creature? I love the Mitch Hedberg joke. Um, Sponges live in the ocean, that kills me. I wonder how much deeper the ocean would be if that didn't happen. All right, so I don't know what creatures he's referring to, but there's some creatures that have an ability to react to and show signs of sense perception. But other than that, they kind of look like plants. They're just sort of sitting somewhere. They're not really moving around. And he's aware of that category of things. He says, "Well, what do we call them? We call them animals." Okay, so they're not just plants. They have the second principle that would put them in a new category. So he's identifying that, another way to understand what he's doing is he's simplifying as much as he can the categories until he finds the one thing that draws the line between them, right? So of all the rocks and all the rivers and all the things that are participating in substanceness that has form and shape, some of them grow and decay and do nothing else. And we call them living. So that's the principle that makes something living because that's all you would need to be a plant. Again, we don't have to agree with this, but let's follow his thought process. That's all you would need to be a plant, so that's all you need to be living. And he says, but so let's look at what principle you need to be an animal. And you might think, well, the answer is obvious. It's in anima. It's to move around. He says, no, it's not. There are some things we call animals that don't move around, but they don't just grow and decay. They have sense perceptions. They can interact with their environment in that way, like, oh, something showed up and so I'm going to pull in my extremities or whatever it is that he's thinking of. I don't know what species he's thinking of here. So he's saying it's not that you can move around, it's that you can respond to stimuli of other things around you. So his conception of a tree is that it's just sort of like a Buddhist monk meditating there. It's not really interacting with its environment except through just nutritional growth and the taking in of things, but it's not like responding to, you go and chop it down. It doesn't go and quiver and pull away or shake its leaves or something. It's not got sense perception. So because he can find a category of something that isn't plant, but is animal that doesn't have the ability to move around. He says that's not the principle that makes you an animal. I found the simplest life form that's not plant. And of course, all of this is arguable. You could say, well, you should categorize it as a plant, or plants do interact with their environments more than you think. Like we're not trying to agree or disagree. We're trying to see how is it that he's making definitions to draw the distinctions to do his taxonomy of the categories, which is clear enough anyway. Okay, so, but it is because of the sense perception, first of all, that they will be animal. For even those things which do not move or change their place, but which do have sense perception, we speak of as animals and not merely as living. First of all, in perception, all animals have touch. Okay. Just as the nutritive faculty can exist apart from touch and from all sense perceptions, so touch can exist apart from the other senses. Okay. We speak of, all right, so first you have to have senses and be able to interact with your environment in that way by just taking in the data of what's around you. Well, how so? Do you need vision, Aristotle? Nope, you don't need vision. You could have no vision, no hearing, no smell, no taste, touch. Touch is the first one. Touch is the one I can think of animals that all they do is no touch. A clam, it's not aiming at something, it's not looking, but if you stroke its back, it closes. It has the sense of touch. So of all the senses, that's the first one that you'll get if you're moved out of the category of plant life into animal life. We speak of as nutritive, that part of the soul in which even plants share. All animals clearly have a sense of touch. The reason for each of these circumstances we shall state later. So now his definition, sort of plant is that which is at least growing and nothing else. And then what makes you not just a plant, but an animal. Okay, so here's another thing to this is another useful thing for Aristotle's perspective. You have, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is right, Elena. It's been a long time since I've done air since. It's a shame that I haven't. You have a vegetative soul, an appetitive soul, and a rational soul. Is that correct, or is that just Plato or Socrates? Or am I getting this mixed up? I believe Aristotle thinks you have a vegetative soul because, well, maybe we'll get to it and we'll be able to tell for sure. So it's not like you have one soul and is it vegetative or is it animal? It's like, no, you have nutritional capacities. So you have exactly what the tree has, maybe not through photosynthesis, but you have the ability to take in nutrients and construct yourself out of the materials and forms, maybe by changing their form and shape into Eunice. So you have a it's not that you have one soul, it's that you have a vegetative soul and you have a sense touch soul. And we're going to see how many souls you have or how many qualities of soul that you have to put you in your proper category. So in any event, um the trees, they just have the nutritive soul or the vegetative soul. That's all they have. But if they just could tell when something was touching them, then we'd call them animals because that's the sensory capacity that distinguishes. I mean, we call things animals if they can tell that you're touching them. What's the difference between a clam and an oak tree? An oak tree lives longer, it takes in more nutrients, it's doing more of the stuff that the clam is doing on the vegetative side of things. But the clam can do a special trick. It can respond to touch, which is our sign that it has the capacity to feel and to sense. Okay. For the present, let it be enough to say only that the soul is the source of the things above mentioned and is determined by them, by the faculties of nutrition, perception, thought, and by movement. Did I skip something here? Touch. Just as a nutritive faculty can exist apart from touch and from all sense perception, so touch can exist from apart from the other senses. We speak of as nutritive that part of the soul in which even plants share. So it's the part of this. Hey, get away from the wires. You know what I'm trying to communicate to you, buddy. Thank you. It's very simple. You don't have to be like that. Come here. We speak of as nutritive that part of the soul in which even plants share. All animals clearly have a sense of touch. The reason for each of these circumstances we shall state later. Okay, let's just let him get to it. For the present, let it be enough to say only that the soul is the source of the things above mentioned and is determined by them, by the faculties of nutrition, perception, thought, and by movement. Whether each of these is a soul or a part of a soul, and if a part, whether it is such as to be distinct in definition only or also in place, are questions to which it is not hard to find answers in some cases, although others present difficulty. For so now we've got his structure. Let's keep banging through this and see what conclusions he gets to. For just as in the case of plants, some clearly live when divided and separated from each other, the soul in them being actually one in actuality in each plant, though potentially many. So we see this happening also in other varieties of soul, in the case of insects when they are cut in two. For each of the parts has sense perception and motion in respective place, and in sense perception, then also imagination and desire. For where there is sense perception, there is also both pain and pleasure. And where these, there is of necessity also wanting. Concerning the intellect and the potentiality for contemplation, the situation is not so far clear, but it seems to be a different kind of soul, and this alone can exist separately, as as the everlasting can be from the perishable. Stay away from the wires. If you would cooperate, you could be in and hanging out with us. Come on, go. Stretch, stretchy, stretch. Come on, come on. You could be a part of things. I know you want to be a part of things. Sit, lay down. Good boy. For just as in the case of plants, some clearly live undivided. Concerning the intellect, okay, so we're going to figure that out later. But it is clear from these things that the remaining parts of the soul are not separable in some way, although that they are different in definition is clear. For being able to perceive and being able to believe are different, since perceiving too is different from believing. And likewise, with each of the other parts which have been mentioned. Okay, he hasn't answered these questions yet, but he's set up his framework well enough, and we've got a good enough grasp on it. And he's setting up these questions to figure out how to dissect the soul beyond that. Moreover, some animals have all these, others only some of them, and others again one alone. And this will furnish distinctions between animals, which is the reason for this we must consider later. Very much the same is the case with the senses, for some animals have them all, others only some, and others again one only. The most necessary one, touch. Let's pause and just recap. It's pretty simple. We got his formula now. We got his approach. So things, living things through nutrition, animals that are beyond just vegetative living things have at least the sense of touch. That's the first one. There's other things the soul can do. Animals, it's interesting, right? You can take a clipping, is that what they call it? I should know this. A clipping from a tree, and you can plant it, and you can get the same tree, a clone of the original tree. It's like, holy shit, the soul can sort of be cut, and yet it's still the full oak tree soul. And in both of these things, he says, likewise, if you cut a worm in half, it's squirming around and it can feel things. And it's like its soul is not just in one location, it's distributed throughout, or it's completely engulfing. It's able to be, you can cut the animal and yet still have the soul in both parts, it seems. But of course, you cut your hand off and it just lies on the ground. And so he's asking some questions. He's saying, "All right, but wait a minute. If the insect is cut in half and it still is squirming around and it can feel things, and if it can feel things, it can have mental experiences. It has a soul and even aims and wanting to not feel pain or to feel pleasure or something like that. All of that's in both parts of the partitioned animal. So this soul thing, I mean, what do you think? You happen to cut the soul right in half? Well, you found the perfect spot? No, it's like it's not in a location. Or what is going on here? It's in all the locations. It's in every cell. What is it? Like, he's asking these questions. He hasn't answered them yet. But then he's saying, there's clearly some animals can do more than that. They can reason, they can believe, right? An insect doesn't have a belief, he thinks, right? Like a propositional belief, perhaps. But that's something that our souls can do. So there are animals that can do just, or there are living things that can do just the vegetative stuff. Oh, so sorry. Let me see this. Okay. Thank you. All right. We'll see you soon, Elena. Okay. So there are things which can do just the vegetative. There are things which at least have touch that can participate in this other stuff. He's just asking a bunch of questions. We got to figure all this out, but we're going to. So that by means of which we live and perceive is so spoken of in two ways, is is that by means of which we know. We so speak in the one case of knowledge, in the other of soul. For by means of each of these we say we know. Similarly, we are healthy in the first place by means of health, and in the second by means of a part of the body or even the whole. Now, of these, knowledge and health are shape and a kind of form and principle, and as it were, activity of the recipient, in the one case of that which is capable of knowing, in the other of that which is capable of health. For the activity of those things which are capable of acting appears to take place in that which is affected and disposed. Now the soul is in the primary way that of means of which we live, perceive, and think. Hence, it will be a kind of principle and form, and not matter or subject. That's his answer to that first question. How is it that you can cut a worm in half and both halves can perceive things? because the soul is not a substance. It's not a matter. It's principle. Okay. It's a form. It's a constructive organizational element of things. It's the way you are constituted. It's something like that. He hasn't nailed it down perfectly, but he's saying it's in that category. It's not in the category from his examples of observations of something like it's in a location, right? We're going to read Descartes pretty soon. He's going to say the location of the communication between the soul and the brain is the pineal gland. He's like, so Aristotle's making an argument. He's saying, well, did you cut the pineal gland in half when you cut the insect in half? And now it has the ability to do these things that are soul-like, right? He's providing arguments against such a position of a way of conceptualizing soul. We won't argue against or for Descartes right now. We'll look at that next time, but that's what he's up to. Okay. And for this reason, we have the right conception who believe that the soul does not exist without a body and yet is not itself a kind of body. Okay, cool. That's a good sentence for summing up what he said so far. That's a good one. The soul, he thinks, right? It's like the opposite of Plato with this. He sees the two categories. He sees soul, he sees body. For Plato, it's the soul is that's everything. The body is a particular, it's mortal, it falls apart, it's an approximation, it's actualizing its potential, but it's really the forms, the things that are more eternal and infinite, those types of things. That's the real deal. Um, and then our reason is our method of trying to get our soul back to connect with that, but that's an immortal type of thing. For Aristotle, it's like the soul is not as real, it is real, and it isn't a body. So he agrees about the two distinctions between the things, but he's saying the soul is it's necessary, it's real, but it's not real without a body. It needs, like it's a thing about the body or it's a principle of the body or something like that. All right. I mean, remember, Plato's arguing directly against all of that. But also notice that they believe in both categories. Like they both agree that there's both. And it's not like they couldn't have denied one or the other. That was available to them for sure. All right. So let's read this sentence again. I believe the soul does not exist without a body, he says, and yet it is not itself a kind of body. Right? Descartes is going to argue exactly that it's a different kind of substance. It's qualitatively completely different from bodies, but he's calling it a substance. Now, he's using the word substance here too, but um, does he say right here that it's not a substance? Because we're going to use the words differently between the two. Substance is so spoken of in three ways to say the case of the form about matter and the third product of the product of the two. Okay, so you have form, you can have matter, you can have the product of the two, and these matter is potential and form actuality. And since the product of the two is an ensouled thing, the body is not the actuality of soul, but the latter is the actuality of a certain kind of body. Okay, cool. But he's calling all of those things substance. So okay, so it's a substance for him too. But that doesn't mean it's like a body. Okay, for it is not a body, but something which belongs to a body, and for this reason exists in a body, and in a body of such and such a kind, not as our predecessors supposed when they fitted it to a body without any further determination of what body and of what kind, although it is clear that one chance thing does not receive another. In our way, it happens just as reason demands. For the actuality of each thing comes naturally about in that which is already such potentially, and in its appropriate matter. From all this, it is clear that the soul is a kind of actuality and principle of that which has the potentiality to be such. Okay. The soul is what's being accomplished. You can actualize a soul if you're the sort of body that can manifest one. Of the potentialities of the soul which have been mentioned, some existing things have them all, as we have said, others, some of them, and certain of them only one. The potentialities which we mentioned are those for nutrition, sense perception, desire, movement in respect of place and thought. Plants have the nutritive faculty only. Other creatures have both this and the faculty of sense perception. And if that of sense perception, then that of desire also. For desire comprises wanting, passion, and wishing. All animals have at least one of the senses, touch. And for that which has sense perception, there is both pleasure and pain, and both the pleasant and the painful. And where there are these, there is also wanting. For this is a desire for that which is pleasant. Okay. He's trying to see how much soul do you have to have. If you're a vegetable, if you're a plant, you just need the nutritive soul. Anything beyond that, anything beyond that has at minimum the sense of touch, but also the capacity for pleasure, pain, and desire. There's no such thing as an animal that doesn't have all of that. As soon as you have touch, you have that because you can have good touch and bad touch. And you can want to not have bad touch and you can want to have good touch. And you can't not have the want for good touch and the want to not have bad touch if you can have touch, because touch is always either perceived as good or bad. The experience, you have the experience of it, right? So he's getting into the mind of a worm and he's saying, the worm does not like feeling this way. And the way the worm, like, how do I know? Well, it's responding to a certain type of touch. It's like moving away from it. That's the only way I know that it has touch. If it just laid there and didn't, I'd call it a vegetable. And I wouldn't say that it has any animal soul at all. The only thing it has, now maybe it has more than that, but the only thing that it needs to have to not just be a plant is to have the ability to respond to touch. We see that it does. What does that mean? It means in its mind, it's having a painful or a pleasant experience and is aiming at pleasant ones and away from painful ones. I wouldn't know that it had touch if it didn't respond in those sorts of ways. We would just call it a plant. Okay, so far we got those two. Let's see what's next. Furthermore, they have a sense concerned with food, for touch is such a sense. For all living things are nourished by dry and moist and hot and cold things, and touch is the sense for these, and only incidentally of the other objects of perception, for sound and color and smell contribute nothing to nourishment, while flavor is one of the objects of touch. Okay, so now we're starting to understand that his word touch is a pretty sophisticated touch. Okay, he believes that the tongue touching food and tasting it, that's a type of touch. The sense of things, all right, we will do this. We will do this at some point. We're going to our contemporary perspectives on sensory input, even the modern perspectives, divide things up differently. By the way, Descartes hated this sentence more than almost anything, right? Dry and moist and hot and cold things are what we are nourished by, whereas the other objects of sound and color and smell contribute nothing to nourishment. He didn't want to think about the world in the terms that Aristotle's using, but that's okay. Um, so for now, we see that for Aristotle, the sense of touch, uh, perceiving things as hot or cold, that's a touch. Right? You don't perceive that through your eyes. You might see steam or something and infer it, but your direct perception of hotness and coldness, of moisture and dryness, those are, yeah, touch the thing. But when you touch it, you get all that information. So he's not dividing it into different senses. Also, hunger, nutrition, looking for things that are tasty to eat, taste itself, these are all touches for him. Hunger and thirst are forms of wanting. Hunger is wanting the dry or and hot. Thirst is wanting the moist and cold. And flavor is, as it were, a kind of seasoning of these. We must make clear about these matters later. But for now, let us say this much, that those living things which have touch also have desire. He's establishing that. Okay. The situation with regard to imagination is obscure and must be considered later. Some things have in addition, the faculty of movement in respect of place and others. Example, man and anything else which is similar or superior to man have that of thought and intellect. It is clear then that it is in the same way as with figure, that there will be one definition of soul. For in the former case, there is no figure over and above the triangle and the others which follow it in order, nor in the latter case is there soul over and above these mentioned. Even in the case of figures, there could be produced a common definition, which will fit all of them, but which will not be peculiar to any one. Similarly, too, with the kinds of soul mentioned. For this reason, it is foolish to seek both in these cases and in others for a common definition, which will be a definition peculiar to no actually existing thing and will not correspond to the proper indivisible species to the neglect of one which will. The circumstances with regard okay, so let's look at this. This is betraying or revealing his approach. It's really interesting. Let's read it again. So what would be a definition of a shape that is not particular to triangles or squares or any polygon? Okay. Shapes are enclosed areas defined by linear extensions which intersect one another. Okay, it could have 3 sides, it could have 4 sides, it could have 28 sides, but all shapes are something like that. But then, okay, how useful is that? He said, like, "Well, okay, I've got a definition over and above triangle and square, which would apply to both of them. But what is it useful for? Uh, it's useful for distinguishing shapes from things that are not shapes, I guess. Uh, that you can imagine that, right? If I've got two lines that intersect, that ain't no shape. I would need a third because I'd have to enclose a space inside of them. That's part of the definition. So that would be useful. But so he's saying there's like two of these. So that's what he's been doing, of course, so far, right? He's been giving us the definitions for the whole category, right? It's not going to help you to distinguish a maple tree from a blade of grass to know that to be either of them is to have the ability to nourish yourself and take in nutrients. It's true of both, but it won't distinguish between them. So what he's more interested in, once he can deal with these categories and say, okay, this type of soul, the soul with an imaginative capacity and a thought capacity, these are maybe categories of types of soul over and above the definition of soul. Has he given one? It's an organizational principle. It's the thing that can be actualized and accomplished by a body. I mean, don't take any of what I'm saying as gospel. What I'm doing is rambling and repeating the little bits of what I'm getting just from this one thing, right? So I'm not telling you exactly what his full philosophy is about any of these things. All right, so let's read this again and see what he's up to. It is clear then that it is in the same way as with the figure that there will be one definition of soul. Okay, you should expect a definition. For in the former case, there is no figure over and above the triangle and the others which follow it in order, nor in the latter case is there soul over and above those mentioned. Okay, over and above. All right. So there won't be a shape that doesn't fit the definition of shapeness, an enclosed space defined by intersecting lines or line segments. Okay. There ain't a shape that isn't like that. Likewise, there is no such thing as a soul over and above what I've described here. The ability to take in nourishment or maybe sense touch at least, perhaps accomplish thinking. The actuality of a body that can do those things is manifesting the substance of soulness. And the soul is defined as the pre-existing substance that engages in that which can't be actualized until it is embodied. Or something like that. Um, I'm poking at it. I don't know. I feel stupid here because there's probably a line in here that is his definition, but okay. Um, So we know that. Even in the case of figures, there could be produced a common definition which will fit all of them, but which will not be peculiar to any one, similarly to with the kinds of soul mentioned. For this reason, it is foolish to seek both in these cases and in others for a common definition, which will be a definition peculiar to no actually existing thing and will not correspond to the proper indivisible species to the neglect of one which will. All right, that's a judgment statement. He's saying what we ought to do is find the definitions of actual souls in these categories, perhaps, or particular to species. That's what we should be aiming at. Okay, this overarching definition that would apply to all of them, and there would be no soul outside of it. It's like, how useful is that? He wants to. He doesn't think that's as useful. Okay. Notice an exact opposite attitude. What is Socrates always telling everybody? Give me the definition that will apply in all cases to everything that is pious and will never apply to anything which is impious. Tell me what that overarching definition. Aristotle's not interested in the overarching definition as much. He's doing some work on it and he's saying, look, here's the categories. Let's establish this is to start the conversation. He's setting the table so we can go out and start investigating and start figuring out the particulars and making discoveries and figuring out, which species have participation in what things and what makes them unique and different from others. That he wants to go get started on that, so he's setting the table with that talk. But I think I'm not misreading this when he's saying, look, it would be foolish to seek both in these cases for a common definition. Won't apply to any particular thing. Let's go. What's valuable about knowing something that doesn't apply to anything particular? It's not as valuable as really figuring out what's true about the clam or the blade of grass or the particular what's true about this specific member of this species even. Okay, we're almost done. The circumstances with regard to soul are similar to the situation over figures. For in the case both of figures and of things which have soul, that which is prior always exists potentially in what follows in order. Example, the triangle in the quadrilateral on the one hand, and the nutritive faculty in that of perception on the other. Hence, we must inquire in each case what is the soul of each thing? What is that of a plant? And what is that of a man or a beast? For what reason they are so arranged in order of succession must be considered. For without the nutritive faculty, there does not exist that of perception. Okay? You can't have that. The first thing you have to have is nutrition. He's already explained that. Then maybe you can have perception and always touch first. But the nutritive faculty is found apart from that of the perception in plants. Again, without the faculty of touch, one of the other senses exists, but touch exists without any of the others. For many animals have neither sight nor hearing nor sense of smell. And of those which can perceive, some have the faculty of movement in respect of place, while others have not. Finally, and most rarely, they have reason and thought. For those perishable creatures which have reason have all the rest, but not all those which have each of the others have reason. But some do not even have imagination, while others live by this alone. The contemplative intellect requires a separate distinction, that the account, therefore, appropriate for each of these is most appropriate for the soul also is clear. That the account, therefore, appropriate for each of these is most appropriate for the soul also is clear. He's got 5 categories for soul. You can have one, but if you don't have the first one, you can't have the second. But if you have the second, so if you have the second, you definitely have the first. You can have the first alone. Let's just draw it out once. There's 5 categories of things that you can have so far here. So let's write them out and figure out. This is the last thing we'll do on this right now. Where did you go? There you are. Maybe that'll work. Okay, let's use that. And we're going to draw it in a way that's reasonable. I don't want to sign up to your dumb thing. Okay. I don't want to start your free trial. You I'm so sorry, microphone. I didn't mean to speak in a low tone so that you'd have to turn everything up. Okay. Whiteboard online. I guess I have to save it since Google doesn't show you the same results from day to day. Microsoft Whiteboard. Oh boy. All right. I'm not going to do it. Technology doesn't love me today. We're not going to do it. Let's just do it with our hands. So, you could fall outside of soul and just be an object, a body that isn't living. But if you're living, you must fall within the realm of vegetative souls. You might rest there, but if you fall inside of that with the capacity for touch and perception, well, now you're an animal. Okay, great. Then, if you're at least an animal because you can perceive, you might be an animal that can move about. Notice it's quite a animus means moving about. So he's really adding a new way of thinking about it that's even antithetical to the linguistically revealed assumptions of the era that he's living in, right? He's saying, look, I'm thinking about this, and you're alive if you can take in nutrients. Plants are alive. You're an animal and not just a plant if you have the ability to sense through touch. That's really primarily what makes you an animal, not your ability to be animated and move around. Or maybe he understands, we'll have to read that the only way you can know if it has the sense of touch is that it moves in response to that. But in any case, then inside of that, you might not just be an animal that can't move, you might be one that can move about. And then if you can control where you're going and move about from place to place, inside of that, you might also have reason and thought. You can't have reason and thought unless you've got the other ones, he thinks. You can't have touch unless you've got nutrition. You've got to be a living thing that can maintain itself. It's like a hierarchy of what's that hierarchy of needs or something, right? You got to satisfy the bottom of the pyramid. You got to put on all of this constitutive, constructive elements that allow you to take in nutrients to be in order to at least be living. And you got to do that vegetative stuff in order to maybe have the capacity to sense your surroundings and respond to them. And then if you can do that, maybe you also have the ability to locomotion, move around and in respect to place. Then if you can do all of that, maybe your soul is the type that can accomplish thinking. And then he says, and he's using the word differently, imagination. That's a totally different kind of soul. There's thinking things that, maybe are like NPCs, like Scott Adams's perspective of, people as NPCs. Like you put a thought in, they spit the thought out, they think in the cliches, they're asking someone to feed them their opinions. Like, all right, like maybe there's a large number of people that are totally engaged in thought, but they're not thinking in an imaginative, creative way. They're not actually doing thinking of that type. It's a different qualitatively, actually. So we shouldn't even call it thinking. So you can have thought, but then there's something even rarer. He's calling it imagination. The contemplative intellect requires a separate distinction. Okay. So, um, creative thought is a different category. Well, we're not reading all of his writings on this, so I'm speculating about. But at least we know for sure from this one sentence, there's these five layers, and you can't have the fifth one unless you have the first four. You can't have the fourth one unless you have the first three. Right? You can't sense things and touch unless you at least have the ability to take in nutrients first and construct yourself and grow. Okay, so we've got it. That's enough of me talking about what he wrote. What the heck how do you find this? What do you think about all this? We can't hear you yet. Hold on. We're gonna fix all our technology issues. Do, 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 do. One moment. Okay, can we hear you now? We cannot. Okay. You're going to leave and come back, and we'll be able to hear you. Hopefully, I haven't been talking through your attempts to say things. Un momento. Bum, 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 ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, bum, boop, 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 doop, 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 doop. We'll just sing our Tumty Tum to pass the time. Tumty Tum, Tumty Tum. Each man must pass the time in his own way. And here we go. We sang our Tumty Tum. Can we hear you now?
Can you?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I'm trying just to take it all in and not get hung up on how he classifies the soul in these different classifications, right? Because you're talking about, okay, uh, there needs to be nutrition. The next stage is perception, right? And that can distinguish between a plant and an animal. But I'm right. My thinking as well is a genetic adaptation over time of having a poison in the plant that the insect gets to protect myself, right? Is that perception in a sense?
Okay, let's add this idea to Aristotle's perspective. Adaptation, what are you talking about? For an infinity of time before this moment, there have been trees and human civilization. Okay. There's no evolution in this. Okay. Aristotle's perspective is that there's always been gorillas, there's always been clams, there's always been people. Um, Maybe nature's a harmony that requires them all, or something like that. So he's not talking about adaptation. He's categorizing the things that are and finding the distinction that puts them from vegetative or from non-living to living, from vegetative to animal, from animal with the locomotive ability, locomotive and thought and imaginative thought. So he's categorizing them. But Aristotle lived in a world where he believed that there were cities of people forever, going back as far back as you can go in time. It's a head fuck, right?
All right, so you're saying that wouldn't qualify then?
So he's not talking about how these things evolve, right? He's not saying you have a material world and then you gain the capacity to be vegetative, and then some of those things adapt to gain the ability to sense their surroundings. He's not doing an evolution story here. He's just categorizing. He's just saying, of all the stuff that we know exists, we call some of them dead matter. We call some of them living matter. Of the living matter, we call some of them animals and some of them vegetative. Well, what's the distinction? Well, the distinction is whether or not that you can move around, but whether or not you can sense your surroundings through touch. What distinguishes living things from non-living things? The fact that they grow. That's the thing that makes them different. So he's just using these definitions and these distinctions to put them in categories.
Sure. Okay. Then touch. It's like you have the Venus flytrap.
Yeah,
Traps an
right.
insect, right? Because there's touch. Otherwise, it doesn't do that
So
normally.
that's perfect. Awesome. Let's do this. This is really fun. I'll put on the Aristotle hat. There's only two ways Aristotle could respond to that. He could say, "Oh my God, you've just discovered a new plant that I never knew of before, and you've shown it to me. And now I have to admit that plants can sometimes touch." That wouldn't be a very easy reconstruction of his system. I think instead he would say, "A Venus flytrap is an animal." That would be the easiest way for him to respond. So, "Oh, you found something that people call a plant, but it's not a plant. It's an animal. I can prove it's an animal because it responds to its environment through touch. It has and it has a perceptive soul, not just a vegetative soul. I can prove it by studying how it's interacting with its environment." We don't know how he would have responded. Maybe he knew about Venus flytraps. I'm not the Aristotle expert if nobody can tell right now. It's pretty obvious. But I don't know if he knew about the Venus flytrap. But if he did, he would either have to say, "My whole system is wrong," or more easily, I would imagine he could say, "Oh, the Venus flytrap is an animal. I've understood what makes a difference between an animal and a plant, and the Venus flytrap can sense touch, and therefore it has experiences of pleasant and undesirable touch. It has an inner thought life of some sort. It's aimed at, it has wants. Um, he might say that, or he might say, I guess a third option is to say that's not really touch. The Venus flytrap. Now this would be hard, but he might say, um, there are motions of plants that are triggered by their environment that don't evince the capacity for touch. So I suppose, so the first option would be for him to say, let's just take apart my whole system. It's wrong. That's going to be a harder one to do. But if he maintains his system, there's at least two approaches. One is to say, yeah, that's an animal. Fits my definition. I'm telling you. If you knew what made the difference between an animal and a plant, you also would have known right away that that's an animal. That's not a plant. The other option would be for him to say, rivers move. Rivers change their motion based on their environment. That doesn't mean rivers are sensing and touching. Plants have heliotropism. They move towards the sun. They flip their leaves over towards the sun. He's either not aware of that, or more likely, he is aware of that and doesn't consider that sight, doesn't consider that touch, doesn't consider that sensation. He thinks that that's just like a rock falls downhill, right? The rock isn't sensing the hill. It's just that's just the material thing that the rock does given its environment. And likewise, the Venus flytrap closes when something is inside it, but that's like a rock falling down a hill. That's not the sense of touch. Or I think most likely he would say it's an animal. Thank you for pointing that out. We found something that people are always mistaking as a plant, but that's clearly an animal. There's other animals like in the sea that are rooted into a specific location, but they sense touch. We call them animals. We should call this an animal too.
Okay.
That's a cool question. We can keep doing this all day with Aristotle too, because as you're reading this, it's like I got a million objections, right? It's like, um, but he's being a very careful thinker, right? Like he's got a system, and it's not like just bringing up a counterexample or a seeming counterexample. His response would probably most likely be to fit it in with these definitions because he's got reasons for why these are the distinctions. The type of soul that can, without contemplation, pull in nutrients and construct itself to grow, that is vegetative. And the distinction between that and the ability to touch is a major distinction. And the type of soul that can have an immediate experience of something through touch, that's the right distinction for animals, he thinks. And he didn't just, it's not arbitrary for him. So I think his most likely response to that is, yeah, you discovered an animal that's on the surface of the earth, not under, or that's on land instead of in the water. That is an animal. We should call it an animal. It looks plant-like to us. Notice that his conception of plants is that they're taking in nutrients from the roots, right? So he's not thinking of the plant as taking in CO2 from the atmosphere and using the sunlight to create its stuff exactly. I mean, he might know that or not. We're just looking at a little bit of what he's talking about here, but he defined the nutrients of where the nutrients are coming in as through the roots. He called the roots the mouth of the plant. So what that means is that, why did I bring that up? I don't know. There was a reason for that. Talking about the Venus flytrap. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Maybe I'll.
No, that's just like I said. Instead of trying to, it's right. It's like entering the mind of someone else and just being able to examine the thought process and how he's classifying it is certainly interesting. And that's where I was like, just some things come to my mind of, well, this or that, or how about, and it's look, so which can certainly be useful and can be what can enable some conversations, as as I had said. Well, what about genetic adaptation from insect? What about the Venus flytrap? So it's a good test, and like I said, examining of how someone else thinks and how they're classifying something, and just their viewpoint,
Yeah, let's do.
without like interjecting and then trying to more so saying, oh well, did he think about this? And if he
Yeah, well,
didn't,
let's do it again. Let's do it again. Do you have any other objections that come to mind that, I mean, because there's so many we can think of while reading something like this. He thinks so differently than the way we do. He said wild things like nutrition comes from wet and dry, hot and cold. And, smell and taste have nothing to do with nutrition. They're just added flavors or something. There's so many things that so he's thinking in such a different way than the way we're thinking that our brains should just be exploding with these types of objections, right?
yeah, I suppose it's I in initial reaction was more on the plant side of what had come to mind. The other one would be that they have discovered that all these roots of these plants in a forest are connected and intertwined.
Mm.
And I believe it's the mushrooms in the forest will help determine of where these nutrients will go based upon which particular plant tree needs it, based upon who has access to sunlight and who may not. And it's this deep interconnected web of right of how you can think about it, which for most people was unknown and they weren't aware of. So it provides some insight of that the plants, just that ecosystem is much more complex than
Yeah.
one would imagine. So right, so when you talk about touch, and these roots are entwined and they're able to distribute resources amongst others to survive and then thrive. But I suppose you could say, hey, well, that's just part of being a plant. Or
Yeah, I'm not sure what difficulty does that pose. So, first of all, we don't wanna because we've only read this tiny excerpt, we don't wanna underestimate how many clever observations Aristotle had made and was aware of. He may have known more about the forestry interconnection than we know, I don't know. But
right,
also, if
right.
it was presented to him, would that pose any challenge to his way of categorizing things? Sophisticated. So he doesn't seem to be taking into account any sort of symbiosis right here. Or
Mhm.
maybe he's taking for granted that the reason why you need all these things is that the whole harmony of the whole requires all of these different types of organisms. So we don't know because we haven't read him on that topic yet. Um, he
Sure.
may be presuming that you would expect the insects and the mushrooms and the everything else of the forest all to be interconnected in ways that we still haven't discovered, even though we've seen the connection between the fungal and also he did also understand that you could take one plant and cut off a part of it and plant it in the ground and get an entire reproduction of the same thing. So when these roots are interconnected, sometimes what happens is that the tree has roots that grow out and then an entirely new tree that's a clone of the first one grows up near it, right? Well, I mean, he's aware of the capacity of vegetation to work that way. He was talking about that before. He talked about even cutting insects in half and having the
Hmm.
same, capacities for feeling and touch in both parts, which is gross, of course, but he's making observations. So yeah, I don't know. Does the interconnectedness of the root system of different trees in a forest pose a problem to the way he's thinking? Or is it more anticipated by the way he's thinking? Would we have gotten to that observation sooner if we'd been thinking in an Aristotelian way rather than in a Cartesian way when we started our science?
Well, I mean, wouldn't that it represent it to be much more animal-like, even though you wouldn't classify it as an animal, to be able to share, distribute resources among,
Oh,
uh,
interesting. Because there's a communication between.
right.
Okay. Um, he certainly didn't bring up the idea of sharing resources as a part of the nutrient thing.
Mhm.
I don't know if it's a challenge because I don't think in his conception that touch is involved in that. But maybe if he hadn't been aware of it and you told him that, he'd go, "Wait a minute, they can't possibly know where they are in their location in relative to others unless there's an element of touch." So you might be right about that. He might have said, "Holy shit, these things are communicating with each other, then they must know their relative positions. So there must be a capacity for touch in these things." That could have been devastating for him, perhaps. I
Mhm.
mean, for his system. I hadn't thought of that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm that was just some of the things I thought of, but don't wanna said nitpick
No,
on.
that's great. This so what we're trying to do 2 things here, especially with Aristotle. First, we're always trying to just make sure we understand the thinker. But with Aristotle, I think he's like the other ancient Greeks that we're going to look at in our second year. They're thinking so differently about the world. Thales talked about magnets having souls, animal souls, because for him, souls are just that which animates. And
Mhm.
magnets can move things. So they're inducing motion. So there's a soul in a magnet, and it's maybe a panpsychism or something that he's talking about. But I will say that if and with Aristotle, we just have this one excerpt, and so it's like, holy shit, what the hell are you like? How are you viewing everything? It's so different from the way we were. My experience is that what we should do is take on as much as we can their lens of looking at things and realize
Sure.
that there are insights that can come from that that we would otherwise be blind to. And so we're going to do both of those as we do. I mean, again, it's just a short excerpt and it's not really the focus of what we're doing here. It's just I really love all the sections of this book except for the historical background one because it definitely seems like uh, it's just let's just give a little bit of lip service to the fact that these other things existed rather than um, doing what we're going to do in our second year when we really dive into these thinkers. But it's rich. It's rich to do that and to think in an Aristotelian way or to think in a Thalesian way or whatever.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
the other thing I would say is the different classifications that he gives for the soul doesn't provide it the significance it does, uh, let's say, or you said like Kant would disagree, right? That the soul wouldn't be significant to human beings, or I guess it's he's saying it like imagination. It's an another level, but I guess it wouldn't distinguish one thing from another. It would just be the classification of that soul, then, rather than just
Yeah,
having a soul, right?
and in 2 different ways it does, for sure, because, like, so for Plato and for Socrates, the soul is more real than the body. For
Hmm.
Aristotle, it is real, but it's not actualized unless it is embodied. It's not
Right,
real apart from the body, and
which is
it's
quite different. I
yeah,
said
it's
a
quite different.
quite different view for sure.
And then to your point, there's another way in which it's a devaluing, which is like, okay, it's I have a vegetative soul, but I also have an imaginative soul, or I have a vegetative soul and I also have a thought soul, and I also have a move around soul or a motive soul or whatever. It's like, okay, are so these are the debates. There are by the way, there are neo-Aristotelians that exist in philosophy today. There's groups and communities of philosophers who think Aristotle basically got everything right, and this is the way we view the world. So it would be important to underline that because all we're doing is looking at some very weird ideas to us that are
Mhm.
weird. But he's got a lot more to say to answer and flush all this out.
Sure.
Um, but oh, yeah. So, yeah, his idea of soul is not it's like if it is if it is more basically real, it's still only potentially real until it's embodied, until it has body. It's not really actual. And it's not clear. So some of the people who try to understand Aristotle have the perspective, this is what I was going to say, that what he really means is the capacities of the body. Or, remember Plato arguing that the soul is not a thing the body does. Aristotle is saying the soul is a thing the body accomplishes, right? It's like it is a substance. It is its own thing, but it's it can be because it's embodied and the body can accomplish it in a sense. It's like, are you talking about just the categories of what things can do and nothing else? Or are you talking about a principle that allows them to do those things, an organizational principle? It seems to me sometimes when I've read Aristotle, it's been so long, that he's talking about the double helix. What he means is the information of the genetic code is how is it that this matter can be a rock over here and it can be an oak tree over here and it can be a person over here. He's identifying that there's some sort of informational principle that organizes the matter into Eunice or treeness or something else. Um, so there are different ways of being an Aristotelian, even if you do think he's correct, of trying to say, because he said clearly that it is a substance, right? So let's read that one sentence. That's going to be the thing that bothers us the most in trying to figure out what the heck he's actually saying here. Yeah, this one. No, not that sentence. That therefore the soul or certain parts of it is divisible, cannot be separated from the body is quite clear. For in some cases, in the parts themselves, not that anything prevents some parts from. Furthermore, it is not clear whether the soul is actually the body as a cellular ship. Okay. Okay, bear with me here. I want to find this sentence again. It's a great sentence to sum up his views. Maybe it was here. Okay. And for this reason, those have the right conception who believe that the soul does not exist without a body and yet is not itself a kind of body. The soul is a substantial thing that is not body, but also cannot exist without a body. So he's not saying the soul is just a thing the body does. But it's very easy to think, well, that must be what you're saying, right? And we're going to read Descartes, who's going to be a lot closer to the way that we're used to thinking about things. But he's also going to say there is mind substance and there is body substance, and never the twain shall meet, except that they do. Or in the pineal gland, the twain shall meet. But it's like a substance, but it's not like a body at all. It's an incorporeal substance. And Aristotle seems to think that a soul is a thing, but it isn't a body thing. And it also can't be a thing without a body. And so there are certain people who say, yeah, I think you're right, because I think I know what you're saying. And what you're saying is it's a thing the body does. But he's not saying that. He's saying, or he's trying not to say that. He doesn't think he's saying that. And so, um, yeah, it's Aristotle's worth way more attention than it's clear that I've been giving him lately, right? Like, stumbling through this right now, we will give him a lot of attention and that will be worthwhile. But as we're trying to nail him down, these are the questions to keep in mind.
Yeah. No, it's is as stated earlier, it's worth examining the thought process and looking through that lens that they are to provide not only some new perspective, like you said, you haven't thought about, but just to it's worth it, whether it's you have objections to it or you don't, you agree to it. It's certainly a worthwhile exercise.
It is, and Aristotle has a lot to say. And Aristotle was like so powerful that all of the scholastic work that we're going to see is quite valuable comes from, I mean, so we're not going to get that. Like, if remember how we read all those dialogues of Plato, and then in this stupid anthology we read like a circumcised and chopped up little excerpt of Plato and it was garbage. We can imagine that that's what we just did with Aristotle as well. um so, and Well, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, sure, that's probably fair. The excerpts we read for Plato certainly didn't do it any justice.
It was horrible, right? I'm still upset
Yeah.
about it. I can't wait to
Yeah.
get out of this stupid historical because it's clearly just almost lip service, and he's only including these four thinkers because the things they were saying, there's still live questions today. But this is just not doing justice to it. And I'm less annoyed by the Aristotelian because I haven't been doing justice to Aristotle in my studies of late. We've been focusing a lot on Plato, but also Aristotle is not somebody that you say, "Oh, that's a curious little historical thing." No, he's really more impressive than maybe this excerpt would suggest. But beyond just understanding the way he's viewing things, um, when we do our deep dive on Aristotle, and it's a big part of this, it takes up, let's say, 1/6 of. It's a pretty big class, the year 2 stuff, so give me a second. It takes up 1/6 of 1/4, so it takes up 1/24 of our focus in the backbone course of year 2, and in year 2, we look at all the pre-Socratics. I mean, we're looking at, like, a lot of philosophers, and it's a pretty big chunk. Um, Aristotle is more worth looking at than obviously this excerpt might suggest, but also, it's worth understanding how he thinks, but it's also valuable to think the way he thinks, at least from time to time, and to have the ability to do it. It's not just a historical, and I'm sorry I can't do better justice to him right now but in this course, they're just taking these tiny little excerpts, and that's all we really have time to look at. Uh, but we will look at him more later, and it's worthwhile. It's really valuable. So we will do that. I'm going to end the live stream, and we'll continue talking.
Okay.